Hey, good evening. I hope my voice is audible. Can anyone confirm if my voice is audible? Can anyone confirm if my voice is audible? If someone confirms me if my voice is audible, I can start the session. So today's session is more interesting, and today's session is on query management, particularly for clinical data management. So this topic will be more interesting to learn how the query management happens and what is the importance of query management and the query management best practices and the important steps and points to be remembered during query management. So I'll think we can start the session because it's 6:01. So we'll start the session. In the meantime, people will be joining the session. So today's topic is on what is query management. That's the first question which I'll be discussing. What is query management? The second question is why do we require query management? So what is the necessity of query management? Why should we start doing query management? The third step or third point, how do we generate a query and what is query generation steps? And fourth point, what are the different types of queries, including auto queries or manual queries, open query, answer query, and reissue query or closed query? And what are the best practices for query writing? What are the different best practices we have for query writing? And what are the important points to be remembered for writing query management or for writing creating query management? So now these are the steps which I'll be having discussion. So without any delay, we'll get into the first question. What is query management? What is the first one? What is query management? So query management step comes into your clinical data management. So now a query is a communication. So generally a query is a communication tool in between two people. Here it is, one is CDM and one is site. So a query management is a communication tool which is used for clinical trial processes in order to clarify some of the issues or the data clarifications or the erroneous data which has been entered by site. Say for example, site enters some erroneous data or invalid data or incomplete data. Then data manager works on queries, raises queries in order to get clarification from the site. So now this is what you call it as query management. So in simple terms, a query management or a query is a communication tool between two people. One is data manager and site, and it is used to clarify or resolve any discrepancies or inconsistency found in data. So there is an inconsistency or there is a discrepancy in the clinical trial data which is being entered by the site. Then data manager raises the query in order to make sure that there is a clarification which is being given by the data manager or by the site to the data manager. Query management is a process in identifying and resolving. So there are two things. One is identifying and resolving the data errors or invalid situations. So which are basically consist of accuracy, data accuracy or completeness or the data which is invalid. So inaccurate data or incomplete data or the data which is not as per your standards of GCP or protocol or regulations. Those data has to be identified and has to be queried. So data manager will raise the query to the site, and the query is being raised only for invalid data where it is being raised by the data manager. So this is about the query which is being raised. So now coming back to when the query is being raised, what is the importance of query management? So first one is ensuring the data quality. So the data accuracy and quality is more important in prospective area of using the query management, and data manager will identify the errors or the issues in data accuracy. So data accuracy is the first point why query management is being used. So to identify the issues or errors or invalid data or missing data or incomplete data or erroneous data, data manager will identify it. And then data manager will make sure that the data is accurate by using queries. So ensuring the data accuracy is the first step for query management. So why query management? So first one, ensuring the data accuracy. The second point is reducing the risk. So the risk of the invalid data or the risk of data quality and integrity will come into picture when the data is invalid. So to identify the earlier itself the risk of data accuracy and integrity and quality of data is the step why we will need a query management. So now query management helps to reduce the risk of the regulatory compliance or regulatory issues on data integrity and also data quality. So that's why query management plays a major role in your uh, data accuracy as well as risk minimization or risk detection. The third point, very important point, is making sure it facilitates the decision making. So it makes sure that the decision making can be taken, because if the data is valid, if the data is accurate, and we can predict the data, if we can understand the data and we can understand the trends of clinical trial data, and we can use this data for decision making. So accurate and reliable data is essential. So accurate and reliable data is essential for decision making. How are we making the accurate and the reliable data? By using query management. So it means that the data cleaning and query management is the process to make sure that the data is accurate and reliable. So for this purpose, the decision making will become easy. So why query management is needed? So there are 3 points. One is to make sure the data is accurate, data accuracy, ensuring the data accuracy. The second point, reducing the risk of the data integrity and quality of data. And third point is to making sure the decision making is being done as the query management and data cleaning is being used to make sure the data is accurate and reliable. So these are the 3 steps why we need query management. So the first step in the query management is query generation. So now query generation and query formation. So who raises the query? Either it is data manager or CRA who raises the query. And when query is being raised, when the data is invalid, inaccurate, incomplete, or data is not as per your standards of protocol or GCP or regulations. Now queries are generated during validation checks. Either it is auto query by the sponsor for the site, and these are forwarded to the sites. These are forwarded to the sites, and site is responsible to answer the query. So now data manager raises the query to the site, and data manager is the sponsor responsibility, and site will answer the query or by clarifying and correcting the error or data. So either they will answer the query or they will correct the data and confirms that okay, my data is invalid, I am updating the data or I am answering the query. So once the query is addressed or completed, the data is completed, and once the query is updated, the information is resubmitted to the sponsor, and the data entry is being updated in database. So there are 4 steps. The first step is data manager identifies the errors, and data manager raises the query to the site. Site updates or answers and get backs to the sponsor, and sponsor confirms that data is valid and data can be closed. So there are 2 types of queries. That's a process of query generation, the 4 steps of query generation. There are 2 types of query. First one is auto query, and the second one is manual query. So auto query is also called as automated query using the data validation check and raised by the system to the site. So it's a not manually raised, it's automatically raised by the system, and this is what you call it as auto query. And the second step is manual query. Raising the manual query is a step when the data manager identifies any inconsistency, inaccuracy, or discrepancy in the data. Manually, data manager or CRA raises the query, then it is called as manual query. So there are 2 types of query. One is system generated query, which is also called as auto query, and one is manual query, which is also called as manually raised by the data manager, raising the query upon the manual review. So once the manual review is being done, to identify the discrepancies or to identify the inconsistency in the clinical trial data, they identify and they raise the query, which is your manual query. So there are different types of queries. The first type of query is your open query. So open query are the queries which are opened by the data manager to the site, which are yet to be answered, which are yet to be taken action by your site. So now here is the first step, which is open query. Data manager is responsible to raise open query, and this is the first step the query is being generated, query is being issued, or query is being constructed, or query is being sent to the site. The second one is answered query. So answered query are the queries which are either answered by your site, or either they have put an answer for yourself and data is being updated. So, but it is not being closed. So answered query is being done by your site. The third one is your closed query. So the closed query are the one which are closed after the confirmation by the data manager or by the clinical sites or CRA that the data is accurate and data is no action further is being needed. So now there are four types of query. The first is open query, wherein data manager or the CRAs are opening the query to the site for more clarification when data is inconsistent or inaccurate or data is incomplete. The second one is answered query when the site is answering or updating the data, and this is to be actioned by your data manager is called as answered query. And the third one is closed query when the site has confirmed or site has updated and the query has no action to be done, and data manager confirms that data is accurate or data is as per the standards, then data manager close the query, then it is called as closed query. So now fourth one is cancelled query. The cancelled query is the queries which are cancelled by data manager when these are the queries which are cancelled by data manager. They have raised a query and they have cancelled the query when there are multiple reasons for cancelling of query. Maybe it is misfiring of query and query is not appropriate, or query is raised by mistake by the data manager. So either it is misfiring query or raised by mistake, or the query is not required for that particular item, then it is called as cancelled query. So these are different types of queries. The first one is open query and answered query and closed query and the cancelled query. So now first I have started a discussion on what is query management and why query management is important. And third one, query generation or query formation, when and how we need to identify queries and how we need to raise the query and generate the query. And fourth point, types of queries: open query, answered query, closed query, and cancelled query. And next step is the best practices for the queries. So best practices for the queries is more important, how we need to write the queries, because there is only one level of communication between the data manager and the site, that's a query management. So what are the best practices of query management has to be discussed in this upcoming discussion. So the first one, edit checks has to be in places for key variables or key data points or risk items. So like say for example, informed consent form or seriousness criteria or outcome of AE. So these are the key data variables. For this particular variables, we need to put edit check specifications or queries. And the wording of output. So the wording of output in query writing should not be any time as leading statement and should be every time clear and short and crisp. Clear, short, and crisp. The wording should be very clear and it should be short and it should be crisp. And it should not be leading statement saying that, okay, go and change this statement. So it should not be having this kind of wordings to avoid confusion to the site. And always give a reference saying that as per the protocol of this page number of this data point, the data should be as per this, and use a reference of CCGs, CRF completion regulations or CRF completion guidelines, that as per CCGs of this data. So please utilize this like this. So now this is how you need to give references. The first one, key variables; second one, wordings; then references. And the fourth one, any manually added queries to the clinical site should have the follow the same conventions. Say for example, data manager will have the convention that CDM. CRA will have a convention as CRA. So the same wording of convention should be used when you are raising the queries for the site so that they can understand. The wording should be carefully chosen and it should have the following information: that which study ID, which site ID, and which subject ID, and which form you are raising the queries. And exactly give the variable names and dependent names. Say for example, you need to give what field the query has to be raised and what mistake was there when the data is being entered. Say for example, the blood pressure is not as per the values or as per the range, then you should properly give that blood pressure is not appropriately given in this particular values. This is what will make you more apt answer from the site. If you give the right queries, then it will be more importantly. So now a query should contain what is a mistake, what is the expectation from you. Say for example, the date of ICF is not as per the standard. Please correct or clarify. So now you have put a query here, you have put a mistake here, and also you have put that what exactly is requested. So please correct or clarify is something which is required. So query composition, what mistake and what has to be updated should be given in a proper way. And last point, important points to be discussed for query management. What are the important points for query management? So all reasonable efforts should be made that all queries should be answered and closed prior to database lock. So all the queries should be closed or answered before you go and lock. CRF cannot be locked when the queries are open. CDM should make sure that all the queries are answered and closed, including automatic queries and manual queries, before it goes for closing of queries. There should not be any data. There should not be any data which is ambitious or which is invalid or incomplete before you lock a data. So now today's session we have discussed about the following points. The first point, what is query management? So the query management is a tool which is being used by data manager to the site in order to identify and correct any invalid data, inconsistent data, ambiguous data, invalid data, and incomplete data. So this is about your query management. Why do we require query management? First one, ensuring data accuracy. Second one, reducing risk. And third one, making sure decision making can be done. And how the query formation is being done. So first you identify the mistakes and then you raise the queries for query management. Or query formation. There are two types of queries. One is auto query and one is manual query. And types of queries: open query, answered query, and closed query, and cancelled query. There are some best practices for query writing. So query should be having key variables. The wording should not be leading statement. Supporting documents should be given. All those things will be there in your query management. And the important points to be considered: no queries should be there which have the database lock before you database lock, and CRF cannot be locked without any having open queries or answered queries, and CDM should ensure that all queries have been answered and closed. So I think today I have discussed about this following topics. First one is about what is query management and why query management, and then query generation and formation, types of queries, best practices for query writing, and important points of query management. So I think with this, I'll stop my today's live session, which is on query management and its importance in clinical data management. So I'll get back with one more live session next week. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you. Have a nice, wonderful weekend.